TN panels. Twisted Pneumatic, or TN, is the oldest liquid crystal display panel technology still used in monitors today. It works by twisting liquid crystal molecules to control how light passes through the panel. This twisting mechanism makes it simple and inexpensive to manufacture, which is why TN monitors are usually the cheapest option available. The biggest strength of TN panels is speed. They have the fastest response times and some of the highest refresh rates among all liquid crystal display panel types. Response time refers to how quickly a pixel can change from one color to another, measured in milliseconds. A very low response time, like 1 millisecond, reduces motion blur and ghosting in fast-moving scenes. This makes TN panels especially popular for competitive gaming, where tracking quick movements is more important than color accuracy. TN monitors can also reach refresh rates of 240 Hz, or even 360 Hz, meaning the screen can refresh that many times per second. Combined with a capable graphics card, this allows extremely smooth gameplay. However, TN panels have notable weaknesses. They produce the weakest color accuracy of the three main liquid crystal display panel types, and their viewing angles are very limited. If you look at a TN screen from the side or from above, the image often looks washed out or distorted. This is because the twisting liquid crystals cannot maintain consistent light output across wide angles. For tasks like photo editing, video production, or even watching movies, TN panels are not ideal. They are best chosen only when speed and budget are the top priorities. VA panels. Vertical alignment, or VA, is the second major liquid crystal display panel technology. Unlike TN, where the crystals twist, VA panels align their liquid crystals vertically when no voltage is applied. When voltage is added, the crystals tilt to let light through. This design gives VA panels one of their biggest advantages: very high native contrast ratios. Contrast ratio describes the difference between the darkest black and the brightest white the monitor can display. TN and IPS panels often have contrast ratios around 1,000 to 1. VA panels commonly reach 3,000 to 1 or higher. This means black levels look much deeper, and scenes with shadows or night settings appear more realistic. This is one of the reasons VA technology is often used in televisions, where dark scene performance is especially important. Color reproduction on VA panels is better than TN, but not as accurate or consistent as IPS. Viewing angles are also improved compared to TN, but again, they do not match the stability of IPS screens. The main drawback of VA technology is response time, especially in darker transitions. Pixels can take longer to shift between shades of gray, which can cause ghosting or smearing effects in fast-moving scenes. Even on models with high refresh rates, this slower dark-level response can be noticeable to gamers. There are several variants of VA technology, including multi-domain vertical alignment, or MVA, advanced MVA, and Super VA. These are all refinements designed to improve response time, color consistency, or viewing angle, but the core characteristics remain the same. VA panels balance affordability with strong contrast and decent overall performance, making them a middle ground between the fast but color-poor TN and the color-accurate but pricier IPS. IPS panels. In-plane switching, or IPS, is the most advanced of the three major liquid crystal display panel types. Instead of twisting or standing vertically, the liquid crystals in IPS panels are aligned parallel to the glass layers of the screen. When voltage is applied, they rotate within that plane to control light. This arrangement allows much more uniform light output, which directly improves color accuracy and viewing angles. The key advantage of IPS panels is consistency. Colors remain accurate even when viewed from wide angles, often up to 178 degrees horizontally and vertically. This makes IPS the preferred choice for professional use in photo editing, video production, and design work, where precise color reproduction is critical. IPS monitors also perform very well for general use and entertainment, since the picture does not shift when the viewer moves slightly off-center. Over time, IPS has developed multiple subtypes. Samsung introduced plane-to-line switching, or PLS, which is nearly identical in function to IPS, but marketed under a different name. AU Optronics created Advanced Hyper-Viewing Angle, or AHVA. Despite its name, AHVA is not related to vertical alignment. It is an IPS-class technology. More recent developments include Fast IPS, which reduces response times to make IPS better suited for gaming, and IPS Black, which increases contrast ratios to nearly 2,000 to 1, approaching the deep blacks normally associated with VA technology. The trade-offs of IPS are cost and, traditionally, speed. Standard IPS monitors are more expensive than TN or VA, and their response times are slower than TN. However, modern fast IPS panels now achieve 1 millisecond response times and high refresh rates, making them competitive with TN for gaming while still delivering superior colors and viewing angles. Because of this balance, IPS has become the dominant panel type in the monitor market today. OLED panels. Organic light-emitting diode, or OLED, is fundamentally different from liquid crystal display technology. Instead of using a backlight that shines through liquid crystals, OLED panels are self-emissive. Each pixel is made of organic compounds that produce their own light when an electric current is applied. This means every pixel can turn completely on or completely off, independently of its neighbors. The result is near infinite contrast. When an OLED pixel is off, it emits no light at all, producing a true black. Side by side with liquid crystal display monitors, OLEDs show much deeper blacks and more vibrant colors. They also offer excellent response times, often faster than any liquid crystal display panel, since no crystal twisting or alignment is required. Viewing angles are the best of any panel technology, with minimal color or brightness shift when viewed from the side or above. There are two main OLED types currently found in monitors: white OLED, often called WOLED, and quantum dot OLED, or QD-OLED. WOLED panels use white-emitting subpixels with a red, green, and blue color filter, plus an unfiltered white subpixel. This arrangement provides good brightness, but can lead to lower sharpness in text rendering because of the non-standard WARGB subpixel layout. QD-OLED, developed by Samsung, uses blue-emitting OLEDs combined with a quantum dot conversion layer to create red and green light. The subpixels are arranged in a triangular RGB pattern, which improves color performance and brightness, but can introduce text-fringing artifacts in certain desktop applications. Because of these subpixel layouts, text clarity on OLED monitors can vary compared to traditional liquid crystal displays at the same pixel density. Users working with a lot of small text may notice colored edges or fringing. However, for movies, gaming, and general multimedia, OLED provides unmatched picture quality. The main drawbacks remain cost, potential long-term risk of burn-in if static images are displayed for extended periods, and currently limited availability of desktop-sized OLED monitors. Mini LED, micro LED, and quantum dots. Mini LED is not a panel type, but a backlight technology used with liquid crystal displays. Instead of a small number of large light sources, Mini LED uses thousands of tiny light-emitting diodes grouped into dimming zones behind the liquid crystal display panel. These zones can brighten or darken independently, allowing much more precise control of brightness. The main benefit is improved high dynamic range performance, where highlights can appear very bright, while dark areas stay deep. However, since it is still a liquid crystal display, contrast and viewing angles depend on the underlying panel type, such as IPS or VA. Mini LED greatly reduces, but does not fully eliminate issues like blooming, where bright objects glow against dark backgrounds. Micro LED is a separate and much more advanced technology. Like OLED, micro LED is self-emissive, meaning each pixel generates its own light. But instead of organic compounds, micro LED uses tiny inorganic light-emitting diodes for each subpixel. This gives it the same infinite contrast benefits as OLED, without the risk of burn-in, and with potentially higher brightness and lifespan. Micro-LED is still extremely expensive and difficult to manufacture at monitor pixel densities, so it is mostly seen in large prototype displays or luxury televisions rather than desktop monitors. Importantly, micro-LED should not be confused with dense mini-LED backlights. Even though both use small diodes, only micro-LED is a true self-emissive panel technology. Quantum dots are another enhancement often marketed under the name QLED. Quantum dots are nanocrystals that convert light into very pure and saturated colors. They are typically placed as a layer in front of an LED backlight. In a liquid crystal display, the white or blue backlight passes through the quantum dot layer, which shifts parts of the spectrum into precise reds and greens. This improves color accuracy, widens the color gamut, and boosts brightness. Quantum dots are not a panel mode themselves. They are a color conversion layer that works with existing liquid crystal display panels. A related use is in QD-OLED, where quantum dots convert blue OLED light into red and green subpixels, replacing traditional color filters. VGA Video Graphics Array, introduced in 1987 by IBM. It uses a 15-pin D-sub connector, usually with 2 thumb screws. The signal is analog RGB with separate H and V sync, and it carries no audio. Because it's analog, image sharpness drops as resolution or cable length increases. High-res text can look soft compared to digital links. Typical use spans legacy PCS and older projectors and monitors. It was originally tied to 640 by 480, but you'll see it used up through 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, 1280 by 1024, 1920 by 1080, and even 2048 by 1536 on short quality cables. Whether 1080p looks fine or fuzzy varies by hardware and viewer because a digital to analog conversion is involved on flat panel displays. Modern graphics cards rarely output analog video. If your source only has digital outputs like DVI-D, HDMI, or DisplayPort, a simple passive dongle won't create a VGA signal. You need an active digital to analog converter box. DVI, Digital Visual Interface, introduced in 1999 by the Digital Display Working Group. It carries uncompressed digital video, TMDS signaling, same video format as HDMI, and can also carry analog on some versions. It does not carry audio. The 3 connector families are DVI-D, digital only, DVI-I, integrated, digital plus analog, and DVI-A, analog only. Single link versus dual link refers to how many TMDS links are present. Dual link adds 6 digital pins to double bandwidth. Maximum practical resolutions. Single link DVI tops out around 1920 by 1200 at 60 Hz. Dual link DVI reaches 2560 by 1600 at 60 Hz. Dual Link does not reach 4K because HDMI video is electrically compatible with DVI's TMDS, low-cost passive DVI, and HDMI. Adapters work for video at DVI class resolutions, but audio won't pass over DVI. Adapter rules that matter. If your GPU port is DVI-I, a cheap passive DVI to VGA plug can output analog VGA. If your GPU port is DVI-D, digital only, passive VGA adapters will not work. You need an active DVI to VGA converter that performs digital to analog conversion. HDMI, High-Definition Multimedia Interface, carries digital video and audio on one cable. It also supports CEC device-to-device control, HDCP copy protection, and an optional Ethernet over HDMI channel. Common connectors you'll see are Type A, full-size, Type C, mini, and Type D, micro. A rarely used Type B dual link was defined early on but never shipped in consumer gear. Type E is the rugged automotive version. From HDMI 1.4, TVs and GPUs gained 4K at 30 Hz, and that optional Ethernet channel. HDMI 2.0 raised 4K to 60 Hz. HDMI 2.1 moved beyond the old TMDS signaling to fixed-rate link (FRL) up to 48 gigabits per second, enabling 4K at 120 Hz and 8K at 60 Hz, plus gaming features like variable refresh rate (VRR), auto low latency mode (ALLM), and enhanced ARC for lossless audio to a soundbar or AVR. Not every device implements every 2.1 feature. Cable and device support must match. Cable classes matter. Ultra-high speed HDMI cables certify for the full 48 gigabits per second feature set, introduced with HDMI 2.1. If your setup needs 4K 120, 8K 60, VRR, or eARC, use certified ultra-high-speed cables end-to-end. New in 2025, HDMI 2.2. The HDMI Forum released version 2.2 with bandwidth up to 96 gigabits per second and a new Ultra 96 cable category. HDMI 2.2 also adds Latency Indication Protocol (LIP) to improve A and V sync in complex chains, TV, soundbar, receiver, and sources. Early coverage and the forum's materials say 2.2 is backward compatible, but adoption will lag until 2.2 capable chips, devices, and Ultra 96 cables ship in volume. DisplayPort, packet-based PC display link introduced in 2006. It carries digital video plus audio, supports adaptive sync for variable refresh, FreeSync and G-Sync compatible, and MST, multi-stream transport, for daisy chaining multiple monitors from one port. A full-size DP plug normally has a latch. Mini DisplayPort is the small variant used on older laptops and early Thunderbolt. Link speeds and versions. Older DP ran at HBR, HBR2, and HBR3. Up to 8.1 gigabits per second per lane on DP 1.4. DisplayPort 2.1 moves to UHBR rates, UHBR 10, 13.5, and 20, 4 lanes up to 80 gigabits per second total. With DSC, display stream compression, visually lossless, vendors target combos like 4K at 240 Hz, 8K at high refresh, and marketing claims up to 16K at 60 Hz on qualified hardware. Real support depends on the GPU, monitor, and cable. Cables matter. VESA certifies DP40 and DP80 cables for the 40 and 80 gigabits per second link rates. In 2025, VESA announced DisplayPort 2.1b with DP80LL, low loss, active cables, up to 3 times longer at UHBR 20, demoed around 3 meters, versus approximately 1 meter passive at the top speed. Look for the official DP logo and the DP80 and DP80LL labeling to avoid bandwidth bottlenecks. Adapters. Many PC graphics cards expose DP++, dual mode, which can output HDMI and DVI signaling through a passive dongle. If the port is DisplayPort only, no DP++, converting to HDMI and DVI needs an active adapter that changes the protocol. This is why some cheap DP and HDMI plugs work on one machine and not on another. Mini DisplayPort and Thunderbolt 1 and 2. The Mini DisplayPort connector is a small version of DisplayPort used on many older laptops and monitors. Thunderbolt 1 and 2 use this same Mini DisplayPort-shaped jack, but add a high-speed data link. They tunnel DisplayPort video through the Thunderbolt connection. Thunderbolt 1 runs two 10 gigabit channels. Thunderbolt 2 aggregates them to 20 gigabits per second and upgrades the display path from DisplayPort 1.1a TB1 to DisplayPort 1.2 TB2. In practice, TB2 can drive a single 4K screen or dual lower-resolution screens through docks and adapters, and you can daisy-chain several devices with the display, usually at the end if it doesn't support chaining. Look for the Thunderbolt Lightning Bolt logo versus the plain Mini DisplayPort icon to know what you have. USB-C DisplayPort, Alt Mode, and USB 4. A USB-C video port is not a new video standard. In most PCs and tablets, it carries DisplayPort, either as DisplayPort Alt Mode, native DP over the USB-C pins, or tunneled DisplayPort inside USB 4. That's why some USB-C and HDMI dongles must be active adapters. They convert DisplayPort to HDMI because HDMI signaling isn't present on the port. Alt Mode 2.0 maps DisplayPort 2.0 and 2.1 onto USB-C. With all 4 high-speed lanes used for video, it carries up to 80 gigabits per second of DisplayPort. If you also need fast USB data on the same cable, it runs up to 40 gigabits per second for video, alongside USB. This is how single cable docks can drive high-resolution displays while still moving data. USB 4, V1, and V2 focuses on tunneling protocols like DisplayPort and PCI Express. The USB 4 host requirement includes support for DisplayPort Alt mode on its downstream ports, ensuring broad monitor compatibility. USB 4 version 2.0 raises link capability to 80 gigabits per second, and for display-heavy use, an asymmetric 120 gigabits per second one-way and 40 gigabits per second the other-way mode. Using a new signaling scheme, use proper USB-C, full-featured, or active 80 gigabits per second cables to reach these rates. Practical note for creators and gamers: 4K high hards or 8K claims over USB-C depend on 3 things at once: your GPU's USB-C and DP capabilities, the monitor's DP and USB 4 support, and the cable's rating. Mismatches fall back to lower speeds or require a powered active adapter. Thunderbolt 5 USB-C. Intel's newest Thunderbolt raises the pipe to 80 gigabits per second bidirectional, with a one-way bandwidth boost up to 120 gigabits per second when your setup needs more display headroom. That extra transmit bandwidth is specifically for video. It dynamically rebalances the link so high-refresh external displays don't choke other traffic. Intel's materials cite support for dual 8K monitors, or very high hertz 4K. Thunderbolt 5 continues to use USB-C power delivery, and with USB PD 3.1 extended power range, certified TB5 cables can carry up to 240 watts, but this requires both the host and the device to support EPR. It is not guaranteed by TB5 alone. Thunderbolt 5 continues to tunnel DisplayPort video plus PCI Express data, so monitors still appear as DisplayPort devices to the OS. Use Intel-certified TB5 cables to get 80 gigabits per second, and look for the up to 120 gigabits per second bandwidth boost. Note if you're chasing the highest display modes. Composite video, CVBS. Composite means one wire carries everything. Brightness, luminance, color, chrominance, and sync are combined into a single analog signal. On consumer gear, it's the yellow RCA jack. Audio travels separately on red and white. It's standard definition only, typically 480 INTSC or 576 IPAL and SECAM, and shows artifacts like color bleed and dot crawl because color and detail share bandwidth. Useful today mainly for VCRS, retro consoles, and legacy capture. S-Video, Y, and C separates the picture into Y, luminance, brightness plus sync, and C, chrominance, color, sent over a 4-pin mini-DIN plug. It is standard definition only, typically 480 INTSC or 576 IPAL and SECAM. Because color and brightness ride on separate wires, it looks cleaner than composite, less color bleed and dot crawl, but it's still below the sharpness of component, or RGB. No audio is carried on the S-Video plug. Use the red and white audio leads separately, common on older camcorders, VCR and SVHS decks, early DVD players, and retro consoles. Component video, YPBPR. Component here means the picture is split into 3 analog signals carried on 3 RCA jacks. Green equals Y, Luma plus sync. Blue equals PB, red equals PR. Because Luma and color are separated, it looks much cleaner than composite or S-Video. No audio rides on these 3 jacks. Use the separate red and white audio leads if needed. The link supports progressive and interlaced HD and, as an interface, can carry up to 1080p. In practice, many consumer sources limited analog HD outputs for DRM reasons, but the YPBPR format itself isn't the bottleneck. Today, it's largely replaced by HDMI. Converting to HDMI from YPBPR needs an active analog-to-digital converter, SCART, 21-pin analog AV connector used across Europe. It can carry composite video, in and out, RGB with composite sync, and sometimes S-Video. A few devices even support YPBPR component over SCART, but that's uncommon. Stereo audio is bidirectional on the same plug. 2 control pins auto-switch TVs. Pin 8 sets aspect and status, approximately 0 to 2 volts off. Approximately 6 volts equals 16 to 9, or 12 volts equals 4 to 3, and pin 16 blanking selects RGB versus composite. Today it's largely obsolete, replaced by HDMI and DisplayPort. SDI Serial Digital Interface, Broadcast and Pro Video over 75 ohm BNC coax. It carries uncompressed digital video, embedded multi-channel audio, and ancillary data, closed captions, timecode, over long runs with locking connectors. SDI generations map to higher bit rates. SDI SMPTE 259 megabytes, 270 megabits per second. HDSDI 292 megabytes, 1.485 gigabits per second. 3G SDI 424 megabytes, 2.970 gigabits per second. 6G SDI ST 2081 5.94 gigabits per second. 12 GSDI ST 2082 11.88 gigabits per second, and a defined 24 GSDI family. Typical copper runs approximately 100 meters for HDSDI, shorter as rates rise. Many 12G SDI devices specify around up to 80 meters with qualified cable. 4K and 8K over SDI. 12G SDI moves 4K 60 Hz on a single coax. Higher modes use multiple links, e.g., dual 12G for 8K 30 or quad-link setups, or shift to fiber extenders for long distances. Embedded audio and ANC. SDI can embed up to 16 channels of digital audio and carry ANC data such as timecode and captions, extracted or inserted by Pro converters and routers. Why pros pick SDI compared to HDMI? SDI's locking BNC, long-run stability, and lack of consumer HDCP handshakes make it reliable for live/broadcast workflows. HDMI remains common on consumer gear and short runs. 60 Hz, the legacy standard. 60 Hz means the screen draws a new image 60 times per second. Each refresh window is about 16.67 milliseconds long, which is how long each frame sits on screen before the next one replaces it. That number matters because it's the baseline timing that everything else in the chain must fit into. If a pixel transition takes longer than roughly half that window, you start smearing the motion across frames, and it looks soft when you pan or scroll. This is why 60 Hz feels fine for static work and video, but looks sluggish in fast games and quick UI motion. Most video you watch is already low frame rate by design. Movies are typically 24 frames per second, broadcast video is often 30 frames per second, and plenty of streaming content still targets those standards. A 60 Hz display cleanly repeats these frames without judder when the player uses proper cadence, which is a fancy way of saying show each frame for an even amount of time. This is why a basic office monitor handles films and news just fine, even if it won't make your mouse feel like a lightsaber. Motion blur at 60 Hz mostly comes from sample and hold. The display holds each frame steady for that whole 16.67 milliseconds, while your eyes keep tracking the moving object. Your visual system blends the held frames into a blur trail. Faster refresh shortens each hold time, which shortens the blur, even if pixel response is already fast. This is also why an instant response panel can still look blurry at 60 Hz. The blur is in the timing, not just the pixels. Power is the one solid win for 60 Hz on desktops and laptops. Fewer refreshes mean fewer updates and slightly lower draw, all else equal. The exact savings depend on panel tech and brightness, but manufacturers and lab tests consistently note higher refresh rates use more power because they update more often. Translation: if you want maximum battery life, 60 Hz is the sensible shoes setting. Bottom line for 60 Hz, great for documents, web, video, and budget builds. Tolerable for casual games. And obviously not ideal if you care about motion clarity, input feel, or competitive response. If that last sentence stung a little, you just outgrew 60 Hz. 75 Hz. First step up. 75 Hz redraws the image 75 times per second, so each frame is visible for about 13.33 milliseconds. That shorter hold time trims motion blur compared to 60 Hz, because your eyes have less time to smear a held frame while tracking movement. It is not night and day, but you can see it immediately when you scroll text or swing the camera in a game. Think of it as the "why does the mouse suddenly feel less sticky" tier. Input feel also improves because the display is sampling and showing updates more often. Even small bumps in refresh rate can shave a few milliseconds off how long it takes for a change to appear on screen, which is why 75 Hz often feels snappier on the desktop and in lighter games. You do not need an esports rig to notice that. Your cursor and window animations will tell you for free. You still will not buy 75 Hz for competitive play. Most panels at this tier are tuned for productivity first, with motion handling that is adequate rather than aggressive. Many office-class monitors top out here because it is an easy upgrade over 60 Hz without raising cost or power much, which is nice for IT departments and anyone who prefers their electricity bill to remain boring. Variable refresh rate support sometimes shows up at 75 Hz on entry monitors, and when it does, it helps smooth out frame rate dips from integrated graphics or modest GPUs by matching the screen's refresh to the game's frame output. The result is fewer tears and fewer little stutters when your frame rate wobbles around the cap. If you see FreeSync or G-Sync compatibility on a 75 Hz model, that is what it is doing. Bottom line for 75 Hz, a cheap, tangible quality-of-life upgrade over 60 Hz for scrolling, UI motion, and casual gaming. If you are watching movies or typing documents, it will look exactly as thrilling as 60 Hz. If you live in spreadsheets by day and play light titles by night, it is the sensible bump. 100 and 120 Hz, the modern sweet spot. At 100 to 120 Hz, the refresh window drops to 10 or 8.3 milliseconds per frame. That cuts perceived motion blur nearly in half compared to 60 Hz. And the difference is obvious the instant you scroll text, move a window, or pan a camera. Everything feels detached from lag, smoother, cleaner, and more responsive, without needing absurd hardware or niche monitors. This range is also where adaptive sync technologies like G-Sync and FreeSync start to shine. Adaptive Sync dynamically adjusts the refresh rate to match the frame rate output from your graphics card. Instead of the screen refreshing on a strict timer, it waits until the next frame is ready. That prevents tearing, where parts of two frames appear on screen at once, and stutter, where inconsistent timing makes motion jumpy. HDMI variable refresh rate does the same for consoles, though under a friendlier name. Monitors in this bracket usually offer wider color gamuts and better panels, IPS, VA, or OLED, that maintain image quality while moving fast. Many high-end productivity monitors target 100 or 120 Hz because even if you never game, your cursor, animations, and transitions look dramatically more fluid, which is easier on the eyes during long work sessions. In gaming, 120 Hz aligns nicely with modern frame rate targets. Consoles like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X output up to 120 frames per second in supported titles. PC hardware can often maintain triple-digit frame rates without extreme power draw, so you get the motion clarity benefits without punishing your GPU or your electric bill. At the same time, this range marks the first meaningful step into the high refresh territory. You start to pay more attention to input latency. Input lag generally decreases as refresh rate rises because the screen updates sooner after receiving new information. The gap between 60 and 120 Hz can shave 10 milliseconds off the average input delay, which is roughly 1/3 of a typical frame's lifetime. For most people, that's the difference between feels fine and feels instant. It is no coincidence that most laptops labeled gaming now ship with 120 Hz or higher panels. It has become the practical baseline for smoothness in 2025. Going beyond this point brings diminishing returns unless you play competitively, but up to here, nearly everyone benefits. 144 Hz, the gaming standard. At 144 Hz, each frame lasts about 6.9 milliseconds. That is less than half the persistence time of 60 Hz, which makes fast motion feel much sharper and cleaner. The effect is immediately visible in first-person shooters, racing games, or even just dragging windows around. Everything snaps to motion, instead of smearing across the screen. The 144 Hz tier became the de facto gaming standard because it balanced cost, panel availability, and performance. It's fast enough that input latency drops to near professional levels, but not so extreme that only high-end graphics cards can keep up. Most mid-range GPUs can drive popular competitive games like Counter-Strike, Valorant, or Apex Legends comfortably above 144 frames per second, allowing you to actually use the extra refresh headroom. This refresh rate also drastically reduces screen tearing and judder even without adaptive sync, since the higher update frequency makes mismatched frames less noticeable. When paired with adaptive sync technologies, G-Sync, FreeSync, or HDMI VRR, the experience becomes almost perfectly smooth, as the monitor adjusts each refresh cycle to precisely match the frame being rendered. From a usability standpoint, the jump from 120 to 144 Hz may sound small, but it is enough that seasoned gamers can feel it. Mouse movements become razor-precise, aiming feels more connected, and even desktop interactions gain a subtle liquid quality. It's also where manufacturers start tuning their panels for faster pixel transitions. The gray-to-gray response time must stay below roughly half of the frame window, around 3 milliseconds, to prevent ghosting or smear. 144 Hz panels are available across almost every resolution tier. 1080 Pi for budget builds, 1440 Pi for balanced setups, and even 4K for enthusiasts who have the horsepower. Most modern DisplayPort 1.4 connections can handle 1440p at 144 Hz with 10-bit color, though 4K at 144 requires display stream compression to squeeze through the bandwidth limits. This tier also marked the start of the spec war among gaming monitor makers. Every brand wanted to advertise higher numbers, even if the panel was just overclocked or slightly tweaked, which leads us directly into the next category. 165 Hz, the overclocked 144. 165 Hz sounds impressive, but here's the secret. Most of these panels are just 144 Hz models pushed a little faster. Manufacturers realized that if a panel could reliably handle 6.9 milliseconds per frame, shaving that down to 6 milliseconds was mostly a firmware tweak and a new sticker, and thus the 165 Hz gaming monitor was born. Each refresh at this speed takes about 6 milliseconds, which barely moves the needle on motion clarity compared to 144 Hz. You might notice a slightly snappier cursor and a marginally shorter input delay, maybe 1 millisecond, if you run a stopwatch for fun. For actual human perception, the gain is microscopic. It exists mostly to give product pages something shiny to print in bold letters. Still, there is no real harm in it. The extra refresh headroom can sometimes help if your GPU fluctuates between 140 and 160 frames per second, because the screen can display those odd frame rates without dropping frames or tearing. In that sense, it acts as a subtle buffer zone rather than a true performance leap. Technically, a higher refresh rate means more power draw and more data pushed through the cable, but the difference between 144 and 165 is trivial. Most modern DisplayPort 1.4 connections can carry 1440 Pi at 165 Hz with full color depth, and even HDMI 2.1 can handle it if the cable is decent. Where the 165 Hz tier occasionally shines is marketing variety. Ultra-wide monitors and curved panels often target this number because it fits neatly between mid-range gamer and competitive aspirant. You'll find it on countless VA panels where 240 Hz would be overkill and 144 Hz just sounds boring. So yes, 165 Hz technically exists. No, it won't transform your gaming life. But if you happen to buy one, don't worry. You didn't waste money, you just bought a slightly caffeinated 144 Hz panel. 240 Hz, the competitive edge. At 240 Hz, each frame lasts about 4.16 milliseconds. That's nearly one-third the frame persistence of 144 Hz, which means your screen is updating so often that motion blur from eye tracking starts to feel almost non-existent. It's not cinematic, it's surgical. This tier exists for one reason: esports. When every millisecond counts, the faster refresh translates directly into lower input latency and smoother frame delivery. A competitive player can react to what's on screen a few milliseconds earlier, and that's often the margin between landing a headshot or spectating your teammate. Games like Counter-Strike 2, Valorant, and Overwatch 2 are designed to take advantage of these refresh rates. Their engines can spit out hundreds of frames per second on mid-range GPUs, letting players actually see and feel the difference. When frame timing aligns with the refresh window, input lag can drop below 5 milliseconds, which makes the experience feel eerily immediate, like your mouse is wired into your nervous system. However, there's a catch. To make a 240 Hz monitor worth it, your PC has to consistently push 240 frames per second. If your GPU can't keep up, the whole benefit evaporates, and you're left with a bragging number that only your refresh rate counter enjoys. That's why these displays are almost always paired with fast 1080p or 1440p resolutions, not 4K. The GPU load must stay light enough to feed the beast. 240 Hz panels also demand tight pixel response times. At 4 milliseconds per frame, the pixels need to transition within roughly 2 milliseconds or less to avoid visible trailing. That's why this tier is dominated by TN, IPS, and now OLED technologies. VA panels rarely switch fast enough to keep up without smearing dark tones. And yes, power usage goes up again. Doubling refresh means doubling the amount of data sent per second. DisplayPort 1.4 can handle 1080p and 1440p at 240 Hz, but 4K at 240 requires the newer DisplayPort 2.1 or HDMI 2.1 interfaces with high bandwidth compression. For casual users, this refresh rate is pure overkill. For competitive players chasing every last millisecond, this is home turf. Everyone else is just visiting. 360 and 480 Hz, the extreme tier. At 360 Hz, each frame lasts about 2.77 milliseconds. At 480 Hz, it drops to 2.08 milliseconds. That's shorter than the time it takes to blink, sneeze, or question why you bought a monitor faster than your brain. These displays exist almost entirely for professional esports. They're built to minimize input delay to the absolute limit that current technology and human reaction time can meaningfully exploit. For reference, the average human visual response time is around 200 to 250 milliseconds. The difference between 360 and 480 Hz changes the display's delay by less than 1 millisecond. It's measurable, but barely. That said, the perceived smoothness is still real. Rapid motion, like tracking targets in a shooter or spinning the camera, looks cleaner because there are more intermediate frames filling the gaps. It's the same principle as flipping through a flipbook faster. More pages per second means more continuity. You won't see more things happening, but everything appears slightly more cohesive. These monitors often use OLED or high-end TN panels, as both can switch pixels within 1 millisecond or less. OLEDs especially shine here because they have near-zero response time, eliminating the traditional gray-to-gray smearing that plagued older technologies. However, running an OLED at 480 Hz requires an obscene amount of bandwidth and power, which is why most of these displays cap at 1080p. A big technical hurdle is interface bandwidth. DisplayPort 2.1 and HDMI 2.1 are just barely enough to deliver 1080p at 480 Hz without heavy compression. Anything higher, like 1440p or 4K, would exceed the cable's data limit. This is why early 480 Hz prototypes either lower color depth or use display stream compression to make it possible at all. Realistically, only professional players can justify them. For everyone else, the law of diminishing returns kicks in brutally hard. 144 Hz already removed most visible blur. 240 Hz removed most perceivable lag. 360 and 480 are engineering trophies. Unless your income depends on reflexes, your monitor is now officially faster than you. Adaptive Sync Variable Refresh Rate. Adaptive Sync, also called Variable Refresh Rate, is a technology that lets the monitor change its refresh rate dynamically to match your graphics card's output in real time. Normally, a display refreshes on a strict schedule, 60, 120, or 240 times per second, no matter when new frames are ready. When the GPU can't deliver frames exactly in sync with that rhythm, you get tearing, where the top and bottom halves of the screen show different frames, or stutter when frames are delayed. Adaptive Sync fixes that by making the display wait. When the GPU finishes rendering a frame, the monitor refreshes immediately. When the GPU slows down, the monitor slows down too. The refresh rate floats between a minimum and maximum range, usually 48 Hz, up to whatever the panel's maximum is. The result is motion that feels fluid, without the judder or sliced frames you get from fixed timing. There are several several brands of this same concept. AMD's FreeSync is based on the OpenVESA Adaptive Sync standard, meaning it works over standard DisplayPort and HDMI cables without special hardware. NVIDIA's G-Sync started as a proprietary system that used a dedicated hardware module inside the monitor for tighter frame timing, though most modern G-Sync-compatible displays simply use adaptive sync under certification. HDMI variable refresh rate (VRR) works similarly for consoles, syncing display updates with console frame output, which is why 120 Hz TVs now advertise it so proudly. One caveat: VRR doesn't mean instantaneous updates. It's still limited by the refresh window. If your GPU drops below the monitor's minimum VRR threshold, say 48 Hz, the display may double frames to maintain synchronization. This prevents stutter, but it can introduce a tiny bit of lag. Still, it's far less disruptive than tearing. VRR is now standard on nearly all gaming monitors and high-end TV, and it's arguably more important for smooth gameplay than raw refresh speed. A 120 Hz screen with good adaptive sync often feels smoother than a 165 Hz panel locked to fixed timing, because every frame lands exactly where it should. So yes, the future of smooth visuals isn't necessarily faster refresh, it's smarter refresh. Motion clarity and response times, MPRT versus GTG. Refresh rate alone doesn't define how clear motion looks. The screen might be refreshing fast, but if the pixels can't change color quickly enough, you'll still see trails or smearing behind moving objects. This is where pixel response time comes in, and why you'll see two confusing specs on monitor sheets: GTG and MPRT. GTG means gray to gray, how long it takes a pixel to change from one shade of gray to another. It's a shorthand for overall transition speed, because every color change passes through gray at some point. Lower GTG times mean less visible ghosting. Manufacturers love quoting 1 millisecond GTG, but that's usually measured under ideal lab conditions and doesn't represent the slower transitions between complex colors. MPRT means moving picture response time, and it measures something completely different: how long a frame remains visible to your eyes. MPRT depends on the refresh rate and how the backlight behaves. A screen that holds each frame for 16 milliseconds at 60 Hz will show more motion blur than one that holds each frame for 8 milliseconds at 120 Hz, even if their GTG times are identical. In other words, GTG is how fast pixels can move, while MPRT is how long your eyes keep seeing them. A monitor can have a blazing 1 millisecond GTG, but still look blurry if its MPRT is high, because sample and hold displays, like almost every LCD, and OLED keep each frame lit the whole time. Some monitors reduce MPRT with a technique called backlight strobing, where the backlight flickers off briefly between frames to reduce the time each image is visible. It can drastically improve motion clarity, but it also lowers brightness, and sometimes introduces flicker visible to sensitive users. It also cannot operate simultaneously with adaptive sync, because one feature needs steady timing, while the other changes it constantly. OLED panels sidestep much of this problem. Since each pixel emits its own light and can turn off nearly instantly, their MPRT is naturally low, and motion appears clearer even without strobing. That's one reason competitive players are moving toward OLED displays, despite their price and burn-in risks. So when you read monitor specs, remember, refresh rate tells you how often images update, GTG tells you how fast pixels can change, and MPRT tells you how long your eyes keep seeing them. The marketing team won't tell you that part, but your retinas will. Display interface limits. Why your cable might be the bottleneck. All the refresh rate bragging in the world means nothing if your video cable can't deliver enough data. Each frame your GPU sends is a package of pixels, width times height, color depth, and refresh rate multiplied together. At high resolutions, that data rate explodes. The display interface must have enough bandwidth to push all those pixels across every second without dropping quality or skipping frames. Take 4K at 240 Hz as an example. That's 3,840 by 2,160 pixels refreshed 240 times per second, over 2 billion pixels per second. When you include 10-bit color and standard overhead, you're looking at nearly 80 gigabits per second of data. That's far beyond what HDMI 2.0 or DisplayPort 1.4 can handle uncompressed. This is why new high-end monitors require HDMI 2.1 or DisplayPort 2.1, both of which push bandwidth well past 70 gigabits per second with compression standards like DisplayStream Compression DSC. DisplayPort 1.4 can still manage impressive speeds. It handles 1440p up to 240 Hz or 4K up to 144 Hz using DSC, which visually compresses data with no perceptible quality loss. HDMI 2.1, the standard found on most gaming consoles and modern GPUs, supports 4K up to 120 Hz uncompressed and can stretch to 240 Hz if compression is enabled, but only if your cable and devices both support full 48 gigabit throughput. Cheap or older cables are often the silent culprit. Many HDMI 2.1 cables sold online are rebranded 18 gigabit HDMI 2.0 versions. They can physically fit the port but choke the data stream, causing your display to silently drop to 60 Hz or disable HDR to stay within bandwidth limit. The monitor never tells you, it just obeys physics. If you've ever wondered why your new display refuses to show 240 Hz, it's probably your cable gasping for air. DisplayPort generally avoids that problem thanks to certification standards and locking connect, but even then, older DP 1.2 cables won't deliver enough bandwidth for 4K at high refresh. Always check the rated speed before assuming it's just a wire. Bandwidth also explains why most ultra-high refresh monitors stick to 1080p or 1440p. Pushing 480 Hz at 4K would exceed even DisplayPort 2.1 limits without heavy compression, which current GPUs aren't built to handle efficiently. In short, until cables and interfaces evolve again, physics dictates that resolution and refresh must compromise. So if your monitor ever refuses to hit its advertised refresh rate, don't blame the panel, blame the wire. It's doing its best impression of a garden hose trying to feed a fire hydrant. 60 Hz, the baseline. A 60 Hz display refreshes the image on your smartphone screen 60 times every second. That means each frame stays visible for about 16.6 milliseconds before it is replaced by the next one. For more than a decade, this was the standard across nearly all phones, tablets, and laptops. A refresh rate of 60 Hz is enough to match the frame rate of most video content because most films are recorded at 24 frames per second, and most television and online videos use 30 or 60 frames per second. At this rate, motion appears smooth enough for normal scrolling and video playback, but fast transitions or animation sequences reveal a faint stutter or judder effect. You can notice this when quickly swiping between home screens or scrolling long social feeds. The lower refresh rate also means less work for the graphics processor and backlight driver, resulting in lower power consumption and longer battery life. Because the screen updates only 60 times per second, the motion blur from pixel response time is usually more noticeable, especially on older LCD panels. Despite its limits, 60 Hz remains the most power-efficient option for phones where battery endurance is the priority rather than fluid motion. 90 Hz, the first upgrade. The jump from 60 Hz to 90 Hz marked the first major step toward smoother smartphone displays. A 90 Hz panel refreshes the image 90 times each second, which means each frame lasts around 11 milliseconds. That reduction in frame duration makes scrolling and interface animations feel significantly more fluid. Text remains readable while moving, and icons glide instead of jittering across the screen. Early models like the OnePlus 7 Pro and the Google Pixel 4 popularized this standard, proving that a higher refresh rate could make a phone feel faster, even if its processor speed stayed the same. From a technical standpoint, the display controller must drive half again as many frames per second as before, so it naturally consumes more energy. However, the additional power draw is modest compared with the jump to 120 Hz. 90 Hz quickly became a sweet spot between responsiveness and efficiency, allowing mid-range devices to deliver a premium feel without a major hit to battery life. In practice, the improvement is most visible during user interface navigation, web browsing, and social media scrolling. In video playback, the effect is smaller because most video content still runs at 60 frames per second or lower. Overall, 90 Hz set the stage for the high refresh era, offering tangible smoothness gains while staying accessible in both price and performance. 120 Hz. A 120 Hz display refreshes the image 120 times per second, cutting frame duration down to about 8.3 milliseconds. This doubles the visual update rate compared to a 60 Hz screen and creates a dramatic improvement in perceived responsiveness. When you scroll through menus, switch between apps, or swipe in games, Hz, every motion feels immediate and lifelike. Many flagship smartphones now use 120 Hz panels as standard, including Samsung Galaxy, iPhone Pro, and Google Pixel Pro series. The higher rate allows the interface to synchronize with gaming engines or animation systems running at the same frame rate, producing clearer, smoother motion with reduced blur. To balance power consumption, most of these displays rely on adaptive control systems such as low-temperature polycrystalline oxide, often abbreviated LTPO technology. LTPO panels can dynamically lower their refresh rate to 60, 30, or even 10 Hz when the image on the screen is static, such as during reading or always-on display modes. This adaptive adjustment helps preserve battery life without sacrificing responsiveness when motion resumes. However, the benefit depends on software support. Not every app or game is coded to render 120 frames per second, so some experiences remain capped at 60. Even so, 120 Hz has become the baseline for modern premium smartphones, striking an effective balance between speed, clarity, and endurance. 144 Hz and 165 Hz. Refresh rates above 120 Hz are primarily designed for competitive mobile gaming. A 144 Hz panel refreshes every 6.9 milliseconds, and a 165 Hz panel refreshes every 6.0 milliseconds. These numbers describe how frequently the display can update the on-screen image, not how fast the game itself runs, but they allow the rendered frames to appear with minimal delay and motion blur. Devices like the Asus ROG Phone, Lenovo Legion, and Red Magic 6 introduced these extremely high refresh panels to maximize reaction precision and visual clarity in fast-paced games. When you look at the difference between 120 and 144 Hz, it is subtle. Most users notice the improvement only in side-by-side comparisons, especially when scrolling or panning quickly across a game scene. The difference between 144 and 165 Hz is even harder to perceive with the human eye, since the marginal gain in fluidity is smaller than what you experience when moving from 90 to 120 Hz. The trade-off is energy usage and thermal output. Driving a screen that updates 165 times per second demands higher processing and display driver workload, which increases battery drain and device temperature. Manufacturers often pair these panels with larger batteries and enhanced cooling systems. Outside of gaming, the benefit of such high refresh rates diminishes. Standard applications, social media, and videos rarely run beyond 60 or 120 frames per second, so these ultra-high refresh panels mainly serve enthusiasts seeking the absolute smoothest experience possible. Adaptive and variable refresh rate. Modern flagship displays use adaptive refresh control to balance smoothness and efficiency. This technology allows the screen to change its refresh rate dynamically based on what is being shown. For example, a display might run at 120 Hz while scrolling or gaming, drop to 60 Hz for normal use, fall to 30 or 10 Hz during static reading, and even reach 1 Hz for an always-on display. The ability to vary the refresh rate in real time is what makes features like LTPO, low-temperature polycrystalline oxide, possible. LTPO is a special type of thin film transistor layer that allows fine-grained control of the driving voltage in each pixel, making it easier to scale frequency without visual artifacts. The operating system's scheduler and the display driver coordinate when to raise or lower the refresh rate. When content begins to move, the software signals the display to increase its frequency instantly, restoring smooth motion. When the image becomes static, it lowers the rate to save power. This system, sometimes referred to as variable refresh rate or VRR, reduces battery drain that would otherwise occur if a 120 Hz panel stayed fixed at maximum speed all day. It also prevents screen tearing by synchronizing the refresh cycle with the graphics processor's frame output. Adaptive refresh technology has become essential for balancing performance and efficiency, allowing smartphones with high refresh screens to maintain long battery life without compromising responsiveness or visual quality. Touch sampling rate versus refresh rate. Touch sampling rate and refresh rate are two different specifications, though they are often confused. The refresh rate measures how many times per second the screen updates the image you see. The touch sampling rate measures how many times per second the display's digitizer checks for new input from your finger. For example, a screen might refresh at 120 Hz, but sample touch input at 240 Hz. That means the device is reading your finger position twice as often as it redraws the image, reducing the delay between between your movement and the corresponding action on screen. A higher touch sampling rate improves responsiveness during tasks that rely on precise timing, such as drawing, typing, or gaming. When the sampling rate is low, there is a brief lag between your touch and the phone's reaction, which can make controls feel less accurate. Competitive gaming phones often advertise touch sampling rates above 300 or even 500 Hz. This does not make the visuals smoother, because that still depends on refresh rate, but it allows the device to respond more quickly to fast input. The processor interprets these touch signals and updates the next rendered frame accordingly. Both metrics work together. Refresh rate defines how often the picture changes, while touch sampling defines how quickly the screen senses your interaction. An optimal balance between the two produces the perception of instantaneous response, which is critical for high-performance smartphones. When refresh rate actually matters, a high refresh rate produces visible benefits only in certain situations. The most obvious is during scrolling and user interface animation. At 120 Hz, icons, text, and lists glide smoothly without the subtle stutter that appears on a 60 Hz display. This makes transitions look continuous and natural. The improvement is also clear when using stylus input or gesture navigation, since the drawn lines or swipes track closer to your real-time movement. Gaming is another area where refresh rate matters. Games that render frames at 90, 120, or higher frames per second can display more precise motion and reduce input delay. Competitive titles such as first-person shooters or racing games feel more responsive because the interval between frames is shorter. However, the advantage only exists if the game and the system on chip are capable of outputting matching frame rates. For video playback, the impact of refresh rate is limited. Movies are typically filmed at 24 frames per second, while television and online clips use 30 or 60 frames per second. Beyond that, extra refresh cycles do not add information because the source content itself is not higher. Instead, video players use frame interpolation or pull-down techniques to match the display's frequency. Finally, there is always a trade-off between smoothness and efficiency. High refresh modes consume more battery power and generate more heat, since the display and graphics processor must work harder. Adaptive refresh systems try to minimize this by lowering the rate during idle moments, but the balance between performance and endurance remains a key design challenge. Display technology impact. The type of display technology determines how well a panel handles high refresh rates. Organic light-emitting diode, or OLED, screens have extremely fast pixel response times because each pixel emits its own light directly. This allows crisp motion even at 120 Hz or higher. However, OLED panels often use pulse width modulation, or PWM, dimming to control brightness. At lower brightness levels, the rapid on-off flicker of PWM can cause visible flicker or eye strain for some users, especially when combined with high refresh frequencies. Liquid crystal displays, or LCDs, work differently. They rely on a constant backlight shining through liquid crystals that physically twist to block or allow light. This process is slower, so LCDs tend to show more motion blur at high refresh rates. The advantage is that LCDs do not use PWM dimming and therefore avoid flicker artifacts. They can also maintain uniform brightness without efficiency loss, but the slower pixel transition times limit motion clarity compared with OLED. Low-temperature polycrystalline oxide, or LTPO, OLED panels combine the benefits of both systems. They keep the instantaneous response of OLED pixels while adding circuitry that enables precise control of refresh frequency. This allows the screen to drop to extremely low rates, even 1 Hz, without losing image stability or brightness consistency. LTPO panels are now the preferred choice for premium smartphones because they achieve smooth motion, wide dynamic refresh range, and excellent power efficiency at the same time. The evolution of these technologies continues to refine how high refresh displays perform in real-world use. Future of smartphone refresh rates. The refresh race has not stopped at 165 Hz. Display manufacturers already have experimental mobile panels running at 240 Hz, primarily for research and specialized gaming prototypes. These ultra-fast screens push the boundaries of motion clarity, but they also highlight diminishing perceptual returns. Beyond 120 Hz, most people can barely distinguish the improvement in normal usage. The focus of future development is therefore shifting from raw frequency toward efficiency and comfort. One major direction is predictive refresh control using artificial intelligence. By analyzing touch patterns, scroll velocity, and on-screen activity, an AI-driven display controller can anticipate when motion will occur and raise the refresh rate only for those frames. This predictive method saves more energy than simple adaptive scaling because it reduces unnecessary high-frequency cycles. Another area of advancement is optimizing pulse width modulation, dimming to reduce flicker without sacrificing brightness consistency, improving eye comfort during long use. Manufacturers are also exploring hybrid architectures that combine organic and micro-LED elements for instant pixel transitions with minimal power draw. These new materials could sustain 120 Hz or higher motion while operating at lower voltages. Ultimately, the next phase of smartphone display design is not about reaching higher Hertz numbers, but about achieving perfect balanced screens that remain sharp, responsive, and efficient under every condition. The future of refresh rate technology will focus less on speed and more on intelligent control and visual stability.